Okay, people are still getting coffee. I don't know. On Monday. All right. Yeah, it's on. Yeah. All right, we'll go ahead and get started this morning. I know, can you hear good? Yeah. I know that we were a little later getting out today. As you can tell, Dan is not here again today. And he asked me on Monday if I could fill in for him, and I did ask if I could use his material, and he said he really wants to present that material himself. So you're not going to get, I think in here you would have been on Leviticus, right? So did he ask you to read Leviticus and then he didn't show up? So did you read Leviticus? You're still on Exodus, okay. Well, see, now you get another week to read Leviticus, and if you try to read Leviticus at night, you're going to need more than a week probably, right? Because it is a little on the boring side, some of it. And that's not just me saying that. Some of it is. So we're going to do kind of what we did the last time I substituted and take the opportunity to ponder a little bit longer the subjects that have already been covered. So you would have done Exodus last week, right? Okay, I've got that right. So we're going to spend a little time on Exodus, and like last time I did this, I thought, well, how could we complement that material and still keep it in, one class? Of course, with 40 chapters, that would be difficult. But I thought we might look at it in the same way that we looked at Genesis. When we looked at Genesis, we talked about evidences, and then we talked about how Genesis kind of weaves through the whole Bible. And I want to do some of that today with Exodus, because I think in some ways it's even more so appropriate with the book of Exodus to do that. I think we'll find that as we go through this study today. But before we do that, I think maybe just spending a little bit of time on kind of the second half of Genesis to talk about the promises to Abraham, okay? Because I think that's going to be important. What were the promises to Abraham? So there's a seed promise that he would have lots of offspring and descendants, right? So that was one promise. He'd become a nation. That was another promise. There's another little promise tied to that. Land promise, yeah. And another promise tied to the land and the nation promise and the seed promise, that through his seed all the nations would be blessed. And that's of course is going to be the thread. So you might think that the focus might become on Abraham, but the picture that we get from the experience of Abraham was really pretty incomplete, because there was a covenant with Abraham, right? There was these promises, and there was a sign of those promises, a condition of those promises. What was the condition? Circumcision, yeah. But that just tells us that there was this commitment, but it doesn't really, tell us the whole story or really begin to tell us how that's going to be fulfilled for us. So that's why I want to just reach back into Genesis for a moment, because when we think about Exodus, and you guys had the class last week, and I'm impressed what Dan included in just a few pages to summarize the book, and yet he had to leave out a lot of things. But Exodus was the major redemptive event of the Old Testament, hands down. In many ways, the focal point of the Old Testament in terms of a redemptive event. So it starts off with taking the promise to Abraham through a very few descendants. How many were there at the time when they went to the Exodus? 70. It started with 70, came back out in the Exodus they came out as a much larger group, but they went into Egypt with a very small number. And so Exodus kind of is this reconstitution of the nation of Israel in a sense. And we're going to see kind of pretty quickly in succession some of the near meetings of the land promise, the nation promise. And then Moses is going to bring this kind of new covenant that's kind of expanded and brings a whole lot of meaning behind it. But what I want us to kind of ponder right now, and there's no way we can cover this in 45 minutes, so I've tried to be selective, and maybe, hopefully I've not been under-selective or over-selective. But what happens in the book of Exodus really, in a lot of ways, controls the discussion of the Old Testament. The Exodus kind of becomes the focal point. Now, we talked last time when I taught this class how you can see the thread of the first chapters of Genesis throughout the entire Bible, but the Exodus is spoken of much, much, much more frequently in terms of weaving that thread. I didn't try to look up all the Old Testament references, but I looked at some material to say, there's around 50 direct quotations from the book of Exodus in the New Testament. There are many more that are inferred or implied. But in the Old Testament, we see that very quickly the Exodus out of Egypt becomes the focal point for this redemptive idea. So go to Exodus 20. We'll start there. See, we're already halfway done. So, no. Go to Exodus 20. And what's Exodus 20? The Ten Commandments. So listen to how he starts the Ten Commandments. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So immediately the identification for the Israelites was not necessarily the promise to Abraham, although that's going to be part of it. It immediately became this redemptive side of what it was like for the Israelite journey. And so that gives just a little bit different meaning, because when you look at Abraham, it's the start of this covenant that he's identified these people that are going to be a special people that we're going to follow throughout the Bible. But it's not until you get to Exodus do you see these models or types or symbols of the entire redemptive work that's going to follow throughout the old Bible. And we see some kind of interesting patterns that we can, immediately identify with, especially since the sense in which God comes in and saves them out of the situation that they had no way to save themselves. And that was their captivity and their slavery and the oppression and the things that they were going through. And we can immediately start to relate to these ideas. So let's look at a couple of references, just 3 in the Old Testament. If you want to look at Psalms 77. Psalm 77. In verse 13 through about verse 20. It says, your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your strength among the peoples. You have by your power redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, O God, the waters saw you. They were in anguish. The depths also trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth sounds. Your arrows flashed here and there. The sound of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightnings lit up the world. The world trembled and shook. Your ways was in the sea, and your paths in the mighty waters, and your footprints may not be known. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So we see in these psalm type of literature we have, he references back to the Exodus. Then you can go into the prophetic literature. If you look at Jeremiah chapter 7, we'll just read a few verses there, starting in verse 21. Thus the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, add your burnt offering to your sacrifices and eat flesh, for I did not speak of your fathers or commandments in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. But this I commanded them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you will be my people, and you will walk in the way which I commanded you, that it may be well with you. Yet they did not obey or incline their ear, but walked in their own counsel and in their stubbornness of their evil, and they went backwards and not forward. Since the day that your fathers came out of the land of Egypt until this day, I have sent you all my servants, the prophets, daily rising early and sending them. So we see these times in the Old Testament repeatedly over and over again pointing back to this event of the exodus of God's people out of Egypt. And then we can go even further into the Old Testament and the prophets. And if you go to Hosea chapter 11, this is a short one. When Israel was young, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. That one is an interesting one because immediately, Hosea being kind of later in our Old Testaments as we have them, we'll see Hosea again. Does anybody remember when we'll see that reference to this verse? It's in Matthew chapter 2. I'll call my son out of Egypt. So this is obviously related to the Israelites coming out of Egypt, but we also have this kind of model, if you will, of Jesus. If you look in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 13, now when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up and take his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there till I tell you, for Herod is going to search out for a child to destroy him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother, and while it was night, and they left for Egypt, and he remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what was spoken of by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I call my son. And then if you went just a little further into Matthew, you'd find Jesus being tested in the wilderness, and he would quote out of Deuteronomy this time, not out of Exodus, it is written, it is written, it is written. So the focal point, of much of what we see in the Bible is almost 5-10 times more, over the events of Exodus as it is over what happened in the first 3 chapters of the Bible. Ultimately, we see the Exodus being another example of a model or a type that we see in Jesus. We see, for example, Jesus being referred to like Adam. If you look at Romans 5, 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus was like a type of Adam, right? Because as all sin entered the world through Adam, sin was all going to be taken through Jesus. And we even see in Acts chapter 2, when the first sermon was being preached, the day of Pentecost, the appeal that was being made was about David. And of course, we have this understanding of Jesus as king, and he's going to have a kingdom that live forever, and a kingdom, ultimately that we're going to be part of. So there's a sense in which, Jesus was the ultimate David. But then finally, there's really also this sense in the Bible as kind of a model and a type that goes back to the Exodus, that Jesus is the ultimate Israel, that there's references that make that very clear. Probably one of the places where it does that the most is in Luke. So if we look in Luke chapter 9, and I think you'll immediately see the connection here. It's the transfiguration, right? So in Luke chapter 9, verse 28, some 8 days after these things, he took Peter and John and James, and they went up to the mount to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothes became white and gleaming. And behold, two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who appeared to him and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting, the word departure there is exodus. It's to leave. That would have meant a lot to somebody who understood the original language. So this idea that here's this connection between Moses and Jesus, the Mount of Transfiguration, and if you skip down to verse 51 of that, when the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. So this idea of ascension or this leaving. So again, we see these connections between the Exodus and also throughout the Bible into the message of Jesus and his redemptive work. If we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, I think one of the ways that we see this very clearly too is reference to the plagues, in particular the last plague, right? What was the last plague to get the Exodus going? The death of the firstborn, right? And so in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, Paul says, clean out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened, for Christ our Passover also has been sacrificed. So it's just one reference to Christ being kind of the Passover lamb. Comes straight from this idea of Exodus. And then I think there's where this really starts to get meaningful, and what we probably will spend the majority of our time on this morning, and that is this redemptive plan, this redemptive work that we can really, really relate to from Exodus. Lots and lots of really practical applications. I think Dan kind of selected 10, and we might revisit those in a little bit more detail as we go on. But there's two chapters in our New Testaments that really kind of expand this redemptive work idea. One's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and the other is Hebrews chapter 3. Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, has many, many references to this idea of the priesthood and things like that for Jesus. But this is where I think, we can really learn some things. And as we consider kind of looking at threading these things through the Bible, I've mentioned this before, that there are cases where the Bible itself gives us a real clear understanding of that connection. And many, many direct quotes, some that are inferred, and I think we can really grasp onto those. I do enjoy kind of thinking about some of these other things that are just kind of seemingly connected, but the Bible does really make a reference on it. And it's possible people take those a little too far. For example, as we're looking to apply from a practical standpoint some of the lessons from Exodus, we see people using Exodus as a reference to a moral code, for example. In our country, for example, it's founded very much on Judeo-Christian principles, and we repeat things from the Bible, or have in the past repeated things from the Bible, kind of in an effort to emulate those things. For example, if you go stand outside where the Supreme Court building is, you'll see the Ten Commandments on the building, right? If you go to any of the monuments in Washington and read the speeches of some of our founding fathers, there's multiple references to things that we read about in the Old Testament and the New Testament and whatnot. And so, just like in the Old Testament, there was some fulfillment that was very near. There are also things that we can see in the New Testament that it was kind of referring to. But then if we kind of go overboard, people make all kinds of theories and postulations about what's going to happen. They try to use the scriptures to reveal things from today. And I'll give you an example of that. What happens tomorrow? The eclipse, right? There's a lot of excitement about that. I don't know if it's going to be cloudy or not. It's hard to say. But I just happened to cross this article where people are looking at the names of the cities that the eclipse is going across and drawing some kind of judgment upon the U.S. because of it's going through the cities, a city named Nineveh, it's going through, and things like this. So you can get really out there. But I think, these connections that we see between the Old Testament and the New Testament are really can be extremely useful to us. And I think in particular, we see, just like Cody was talking about this morning, talking about the response to sin. Well, we see that all throughout the Old Testament. Inappropriate response to sin, appropriate response to sin, consequences of sin. We see it played out. I think that's why it's recorded for us. But going back to both the 1 Corinthians text and also the Hebrews text, it brings us these interplays between God having taken the Israelites out of Egypt, and they're not quite to the promised land yet, right? Well, they didn't just immediately, boom, they're in the promised land. Did they all make it to the promised land? No. So why is that an important model for us? It's not once saved, always saved. That's correct. It's not once saved, always saved. Is there something, once we respond to the gospel and ultimately become Christians, are there things that we have to be mindful of? Are there things that we have to do in order to enter the promised land? Well, yes, there are. So listen to this discussion here in 1 Corinthians verses 1 through 14. 1 Corinthians 10. For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and they all ate the same spiritual food. Well, what food did they eat? Manna, right? And they drank the same spiritual drink, for they are drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. So now we're talking about that 40-year period where they couldn't go in. Now these things happen as an example for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, for as is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and sit up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did, and the 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpent. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon which the end of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Note, and I went on to verse 13 here because we often quote this verse out of context. But look at the context of this verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you, but such is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will provide a way of escape so that you will be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Now, that is really, really packed with things that are really, really valuable to us as Christians in terms of applying what happened in Exodus. Think about that. When they were saved or redeemed from Israel, did things get easy or hard? They got hard. They were extremely hard. In our modern society, most of us have all the food, water we need. We have facilities to use. We have soft beds to sleep on. Even in slavery, Israel had some of those things, even though they were being oppressed. And just to go out to be in the wilderness, is a difficult thing. Some people who are not prepared for that don't last very long. They die very quickly. It's called exposure. It's a very common thing. Like most of us, if you just stuck us out in the woods for a week, some of us just wouldn't make it just from that. So they were being asked to do this hard thing. And so when you read that passage, no temptation has overtaken you, and you go back to some of these references here about complaining and grumbling, hey, it's real. It's real, and it was some real tangible events that we can certainly relate to. Any comments on that or questions on that? Yeah.
It wasn't ever intended for it to take 40 years or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's never God's original intention. But because of their examples here,
Yep.
their murmuring, their disbelief, their disobeying on the journey, it cost many their lives.
Yeah. She was saying it wasn't intended for them to have to spend 40 years. It was the consequence of their sin, essentially, that cost them that, which is very true. We're the ones who make it hard, aren't we? God gives us pretty simple instructions, and we're the ones who make it difficult. I think too, again, to Cody's lesson about the consequences of sin and what to do when we sin. And I think that's why a lot of this is an example to us. It's no different for us in that we, as we come to know Christ and understand His law, and what's the closest equivalent, would you say, to the book of Exodus for us today in terms of understanding what's right and wrong in the New Testament? What guides us in our daily living? What set of teachings? What's that?
The apostles, the words that were recorded.
In totality, yeah, I say that's correct. The apostles in all of the New Testament. But what about the Sermon on the Mount, for example? Like, that's a very condensed lesson on Christian living. Who's mastered the Sermon on the Mount? Anyone? It's a difficult thing to master any portion of it. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount would often, quote or make reference to the old law, and then he would expand it to attack where the root of the problem was, which was in our heart, right? And so it really makes us understand our sinfulness. So, there is I think all this kind of discussion gives a lot of credence to, there's a lot of value in us studying Exodus and looking at what happened to the Israelites. Jesus was essentially teaching out of that in his early ministry, obviously. Anything else? We're going to go to Hebrews next. Okay, let's go to Hebrews chapter 3. Hebrews chapter 3. Again, the whole chapter, but I'm going to pick up the first 6 verses and then jump to 16 through 19. It says, "Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. He was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was in all his house. For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, But just as much the builder of the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken of later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and boast of the hope firm until the end. Now verse 16, if you jump down to 16, for who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt, led by Moses? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned and those whose body fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that he would not enter the rest, but those who were disobedient? So we see that they are not able to enter because of unbelief. So again, it's taking that very tangible event with very clearly defined sins and very specifically laid out, and bringing it forward into the Christian dispensation and an understanding of our relationship to sin and what it means to be disobedient and what it means to be faithful and what it means to believe. So it's really beautiful how all this connects. And like I said, there are in the New Testament about 50 quotes, and I only picked just a few to point that out. So any comments or questions on that? Yeah.
Strong message there that's retaught in the New Testament. Disobedience is unbelief. That is one of the major things we're trying to overcome with these people that we talk to.
Mm.
And over again, they believe in their head. They read the word believe, and that's as far as they want to go. They don't want to read John 3:36. It says, he who believes in the Son has everlasting life. He who does not obey the Son shall not see life. Disobedience is disbelief.
Right, so Steve's just making the connection between belief and disobedience, and they go together. You cannot separate them. Yes?
It wasn't an easy journey.
Mm-mm.
Moses, the Bible said, was the meekest man who ever lived.
Mm.
He put himself below others, but he didn't make it.
Mm-hmm.
Moses did not make it to the promised land. He come a long way. Never made it. So Joshua, Caleb, only two that I can think that actually did make it, started that long journey. So being a Christian is not easy. It's worth it, but it's easy to skip.
Yep, good point. Ron was just mentioning how even Moses didn't make it. So I want to go through, while we have just a few minutes left, some of the practical applications that Dan had brought out, but in light of some of the things that we just talked about. So the first one that Dan mentioned in your handout from last time was God is a promise-keeping God. And I think we can see that immediately the first thing that happens is this multiplication of the Hebrew nation. Despite Abraham's death, the promise is being fulfilled. And there was an early perspective to it that we read of in our Old Testaments, how they did become a great nation. We read about that in 2 Samuel and 1 Kings. We see early on in Genesis how, Abraham tried to help when he thought the seed thing wasn't going to come true, right? And so we see that seed promise already start in Genesis. We see the land promise, finally come into effect with Joshua, right? But then also we see not only God as a promise-keeping God from the perspective of that earthly and near-term perspective, but then that spiritual perspective. So we see the same language talked about us as being a great nation in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, we're a holy priesthood, a royal nation, a people for God's own possession. We're spoken of as if we were part of that Exodus journey, just like they were. We see, the land promise too, from the standpoint of us eventually having eternal life and being with God in heaven one day. We see the seed promise in the Galatians talks about how we're essentially part of Abraham's offspring, even though we don't have that direct lineage. That's played out in Galatians chapter 3. So there's so many connections to God being a promise-keeping God, specifically to the events of Exodus. The next point that Dan had was God has the ability to rescue his people from danger. From the earthly perspective and the spiritual perspective, we see that being played out. We understand the passage that we read earlier that talks about how no temptation is going to be too much for us. God's going to provide a way of escape. But obviously we see the same thing happen even before the book of Exodus, in that God provided a way for Israel through this terrible event with Joseph, right? And that ends up actually putting God's people in this situation where they can multiply and grow and need saving. So we see the promises to Abraham happen in ways that we as human beings can watch the story and realize if we were sitting in it, we'd be like, this isn't working out so good. But in fact, what we think is not working out so good is God working his plan. So since we don't have that much time, how do we relate that to today? We live in a country that was founded, upon some principles that we all agree on. We'd like to see it go back to those things, but if we look at it from just our perspective, it's incredibly discouraging, right? It's not working out. But then if we try to expand that to the totality of things, look at how things worked out for Joseph. Look at how things worked out for Israel, being put into this period of persecution and difficulty, and what happened. So, we know the ultimate outcome. Perhaps we can get too wrapped up in the near-term outcome. I think that's a huge lesson for us. And it really played out for God's ability to rescue his people, but also for his ability to sustain his people. So that was the next point that Dan had from his material. So they came out of Egypt with really no supplies or no means to survive in the desert, and yet God provided food, right? He provided water. I'll just make a little plug here in my kind of looking through material. There's a group called Appia Media that puts out videos that are actually quite good, and they've just premiered a movie in 2 or 3 states, not here unfortunately, called Out of Egypt, where these young filmmakers are retracing the steps of the Exodus in the modern day world, and must have done this recently, but these films will eventually be available for free. They are available for free actually, but they're doing some on-site viewings of it, and I know some of the people involved with it are affiliated with the church, and so I think it'd be a really interesting thing to watch. But we see again this provision that happened from a physical standpoint for Israel. How is the manifestation of that, I guess you could say, in the New Testament of the bread and the water? Where do we see that in our spiritual walk? What's Jesus referred to as? The bread of life. And also, he's also referred to as someone being the source of living water with the woman at the well, remember? And so that comes through as well. God is sovereign is the next reference that was a practical example. And so Dan mentioned that every plague was an attack on a particular god that Egypt worshipped. So, for example, the Nile had a god that they worshipped, and what happened to the Nile during the plagues? It was turned to blood. What's probably the most famous god in Egypt that most people know who that is? Ra, which is the god of the sun. And one of the plagues was to do what? Darkness, right? And so God in his sovereignty was showing that he was superior and is really the only true God to the Israelites. And I think that's kind of a message for us today. You know, we have a lot of people trying to teach that there are many gods and many ways to please some God out there. But God is sovereign and has shown us that there's one way through his son, Jesus Christ. God is a covenant-making God. So I mentioned the start of this, that the covenant started with Abraham through circumcision, but we didn't really see the redemption work kind of spelled out for us until the Exodus. And now we understand we're under the new covenant that Jesus made with us. And there are a lot of symbols and types that we can look back to the Old Testament to understand our covenant, how they're all interrelated. So the Exodus is an important model of God's plan to redeem humanity. Jesus in particular kind of was a bit of a shadow, the things that happened with the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh wanted to kill the babies, right? That's why Moses ended up in a basket. Incidentally, the midwives said no. You remember that? They said they didn't want to kill the babies as they came out because they feared God more than they feared the Egyptians. I think that's a lesson for us as well. But Jesus, in a way, lived this out as well because, yes, go ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
It's so interesting if you look at the descriptions of the covenant in the Old and New Testament. How many of the descriptions begin with the word if?
Yep.
If you keep my commandments, if you walk in the light, if you are united with him in the likeness of his death, just which happens to be baptism. It's a covenant with requirements.
Yep. So many of the covenants start with if. I think that's very good. And it was true for the Old Covenant, and it's true for the New Covenant. So I hope, I really enjoyed studying for this and preparing for this class because it made me really reinvigorate this idea that if we want to have a deeper understanding of the New Testament, we need to dig a little in the Old Testament. So get Leviticus read for next week. I think that's your next class. So thank you for your time.